You owe us $1,000 for swimming. Seriously? That's what this outrageous HOA woman told me after handing me the most ridiculous violation in the neighborhood's history just for taking a dip in my own family's lake. But here's what she didn't realize. Her biggest blunder was about to become my greatest win. By the end of this, she would be the one paying me $5,000 every single year. And believe me, that's not even the wildest part. What follows will make you question everything you thought you knew about HOA power trips. This revenge story is so unbelievable, even Hollywood couldn't script it better. Let me rewind and explain how this madness began. My name is Logan Reed, a 45-year-old high school history teacher who only wanted a quiet life in the lakefront cottage I inherited from my grandmother. You've heard the saying, no good deed goes unpunished? Well, try inheriting prime property and watch how quickly the neighborhood vultures swoop in when they smell opportunity. It all started on a rough Tuesday in March, right after the most exhausting parent-teacher conferences of my 23-year career. You know the type of parents convince their child is some misunderstood genius, and if they're failing, it's obviously the teacher's fault. I was drained, frustrated, and in desperate need of my usual swim to clear my head. That lake behind my house was my sanctuary, the one place I could escape from noisy classrooms and endless complaints. Ever since my grandmother passed and left me the cottage a year and a half ago, it had been my safe haven. But the peace didn't last long. I had barely stepped out of the water when a clipboard appeared in my peripheral vision. Stop, you're contaminating the community watershed. The voice belonged to Grace Perez, a woman I'd seen around but never spoken to. She looked like she was headed to a board meeting, a designer tracksuit, perfect hair, and that clipboard clutched like a weapon. There I was, standing on my own property, dripping wet, while she acted like I had just poured toxic waste into a public fountain. Excuse me? I asked, genuinely baffled. This is my private lake. I was just swimming. Grace gave me a smile. But it wasn't kinda, it was the sort of smile that comes right before someone ruins your day. Your home membership agreement makes all water features community property, she said smoothly. You're in violation of Environmental Protection Code 15C, unauthorized swimming activities resulting in chemical runoff into the watershed. Then she held up some device, supposedly measuring water contamination levels. The whole encounter felt surreal. Like I'd stumbled into some bizarre alternate reality where swimming in your own backyard was a criminal act. That's when she delivered the punch. Environmental impact assessment and restoration fee $1,000, plus $150 for each additional day until compliance is achieved. $1,000 for swimming. I stared at her, waiting for her to laugh and admit it was a joke, but her expression stayed icy serious. Her hands trembled slightly as she scribbled out the citation, and I couldn't help noticing the pawn shop tag still hanging from her designer purse. Her phone buzzed something about a final noticia and she quickly silenced it, her jaw tightening in panic. Look, there's obviously some mistake, I said, forcing calm into my voice. My family has owned this lake since 1923. I have the original deed. But Grace was already backing away with that plastic smile plastered on her face. Some property owners think ownership gives them the right to pollute. Mr. Reed, we've had issues in the past with irresponsible pet owners. Something about the way she said that made my blood run cold. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling something was terribly wrong. My instincts as a teacher told me this woman was dangerous. So I spent hours digging into whole laws, property rights, and environmental codes until I found a newspaper article from 3 years earlier. 3 dogs die from chemical poisoning after HOA environmental project. My hands shook as I read it. The names were right there, buddies included alongside photos of 2 other neighborhood pets. The article quoted none other than Grace Perez, defending the necessary environmental maintenance that had killed them. Her words hit like a gut punch. Property maintenance standards must be upheld regardless of pet owner negligence. I remembered that horrible week when Buddy, my dog, fell sick at the vet bills, the endless worry, and the night I held him as he died in agony. We thought it was a tragic accident, but now I knew the truth. Grace hadn't just poisoned my dog, she was now coming after my home. That night, near midnight, I called Detective Lewis Wilson. He had been my father's partner for 15 years. And after Dad passed, He became like family. Grace Perez killed Buddy, and now she's targeting me, I told him, shaking with rage. I never forgot that case, Logan, Lewis replied without hesitation. I always suspected it wasn't accidental. Your dad would have wanted justice for his grandson's dog. That's what my father always called Buddy, his grandson. The idea that someone had deliberately poisoned that sweet, innocent animal made me see red. By dawn, Lewis had run a full background check on Grace. What he found connected every piece of the puzzle. She's sitting on $75,000 in gambling debt. Her house is already in foreclosure. She's got 90 days to come up with $52,000 or she loses everything. She's been issuing bogus violations left and right, targeting the wealthier properties in the neighborhood. The pattern couldn't have been clearer. Grace wasn't just a strict HOA president. She was a desperate criminal using her position to squeeze money out of homeowners. And my lakefront cottage? That was the biggest prize in her sights. But here's where things went from bad to terrifying. The next morning, I woke up to find her standing outside my fence, talking on the phone in a hushed voice. The teacher won't be a problem much longer, I heard her say. I know exactly how to deal with people like him. Just make sure it's handled by Friday. When she realized I was watching from the window, she cut the call short and waved at me with that same icy, unsettling smile. Just make sure it's handled by Friday. Those words echoed in my head. What was she planning? And who was she talking to? The following morning, Detective Luis Wilson showed up at my house with coffee in one hand and a fat case file in the other. He set it down with a heavy thud. I failed your father, and I failed Buddy. Logan, I'm not going to fail you. Inside were his original notes from Buddy's Kazi, stacks of evidence that had been brushed aside 3 years ago as circumstantial. Seeing those photos of my dog inside an official file shattered me all over again, but it also ignited something. Grace wasn't getting away with this. Not this time. Luis spread out records across my kitchen table. She's a textbook case of a desperate gambler. 75 grand in casino losses, nearly 30,000 in medical bills from her late husband's illness, and a foreclosure notice she can't outrun. When gambling fails, people like her turn to fraud. That's exactly what she's doing, manufacturing violations to drain wealthy homeowners. And your property is the crown jewel. Within a week, her harassment campaign exploded. First came a $400 fine for noise pollution from splashing in the lake, then a $550 fine for unauthorized dock modification. So apparently the dock my grandmother built back in 1962 was now considered an environmental threat. By the end of the week, she had hit me with over $3,000 in totally fake penalties. And it wasn't just me. My neighbor Tom, a mechanic who lived there for 2 decades, told me she slapped him with an $1,100 fine for parking his work truck in his own driveway. I suddenly classified as a commercial vehicle violation. Soon, more neighbors came forward. Maria got fined $800 for excessive holiday decorations. All she'd hung was a single wreath on her door. Frank got hit with $950 for his vegetable garden, which Grace decided counted as unauthorized landscaping. The truth was obvious. Grace was systematically targeting anyone she thought had money, racking up over $22,000 in bogus fines across the community in less than 2 months. And it wasn't just about money, as she was psychologically tormenting people, making them scared to enjoy their own homes. That's when Emily Smith, the HOA treasurer, reached out to me in secret. A single mom who relied on her role for health insurance. She was torn apart by what she discovered in the books. Grace has stolen $38,000 through fake vendor invoices, Emily whispered during a quiet meeting at a coffee shop. She set up a shell company, Environmental Solutions LLC, and has been paying herself for services that never happened. I have everything you need. Bank statements, forged signatures with my name, all of it. Her hands trembled as she pushed the evidence toward me. My daughter needs to see me do the right thing, she said. But when I started asking questions, Grace told me accident-prone employees sometimes lose their jobs. I know exactly what she meant. Emily's courage was incredible. What finally pushed her over the edge was learning that Grace had siphoned off funds meant for new playground equipment and used them to cover her casino debts. Luis's plan was simple but brilliant. "We're going to trap her into confessing," Desperate gamblers always think they can outsmart the system. You'll call her, act like you've given up, and suggest a private settlement. She'll see it as easy money, and her arrogance will make her slip up. It was risky, but Luis had seen this kind of setup play out dozens of times. Sure enough, when I called Grace 3 days later, I made sure to sound completely beaten down. "I can't afford more legal battles, Grace. Maybe we can work out something privately." Her response was instant and chillingly eager. "Finally, someone who understands environmental responsibility," she purred. "I knew you'd come around, Mr. Reed. Why don't you come to my house tomorrow evening, and we'll discuss a reasonable settlement?" What she didn't know was that Luis had already fitted me with a wire. Every word she spoke inside that house would be recorded. Her home, when I arrived, was a strange monument to someone drowning in debt but desperate to project wealth. Grace's house looked flawless from the outside. The yard was neatly trimmed, the paint was fresh, and everything screamed of perfection. But when she opened the door, reality bled through. There was a foreclosure notice taped right to her kitchen window. She had staged our meeting like some sort of business negotiation. Papers were carefully arranged across her dining table, and that same fake environmental testing device sat prominently, like it gave her authority. Her hands trembled as she tried to appear composed, her eyes darting to her phone again and again like she was waiting for some critical news. "I'm glad we can handle this like civilized adults," she began smoothly, though her eyes glittered with predatory intent. She slid a paper across the table. "Your lakefront property presents serious environmental challenges for the entire community watershed. A fair solution would be a 50-50 shared access agreement." I nearly laughed at the audacity. Half ownership of my family's lake on the basis of imaginary violations. The arrogance was staggering. Still, I kept my defeated act going. "I keep thinking about my dog, Buddy," I said, deliberately. "You were involved in environmental projects back then too, weren't you?" Her mask cracked. For a split second, something cold and venomous passed over her face. "That dog polluted the community water with waste," she snapped. "Irresponsible pet owners risk entire neighborhoods. I had to take extreme action to protect environmental standards." There it was, a direct admission. She had just confessed to killing my best friend and every word was being recorded by the wire Luis had hidden on me. But she didn't stop there. Her guilt came spilling out in a frenzy. "Your property affects water quality and community property values," she ranted. "I created alternate funding through HOA accounts to ensure proper oversight." In one breath, she confessed to animal cruelty and embezzlement, too blinded by her anger to realize the noose tightening around her. That's when Luis emerged from behind my car, cuffs in hand. "Grace Perez, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and criminal harassment." The transformation was instant. Grace went from smug predator to cornered beast in seconds. She shrieked about entrapment, conspiracies, anything she could think of, but it was over. As the cuffs locked around her wrists, I felt something I hadn't felt since Buddy's death at Justice, but the relief didn't last long. As the patrol car pulled away with Grace inside, I noticed a black sedan with out-of-state plates slowly following behind. My neighbor Tom jogged over, worry written all over his face. "Logan, that car's been parked here for 3 days. Emily told me Grace kept mentioning someone else. Someone coming to handle things. Whoever she was working with, they're still watching you." I had thought Grace's arrest was the end of my nightmare, but I couldn't have been more wrong. The next night's community meeting felt less like a neighborhood gathering and more like a battlefield. 78 residents showed up, and the largest turnout in HOA history. I told a Machiavelli expected celebration, maybe even relief. Instead, the room was split in two. Grace's loyalists on one side glared at those of us who had stood against her. The tension was suffocating. Tom, bless him, had volunteered to chair the meeting, but even his military experience hadn't prepared him for this level of hostility. "We're here to decide whether we've removed a criminal from office or destroyed an innocent woman's life," declared Helen Morrison, a 78-year-old retired teacher who had somehow become Grace's most fervent supporter. Grace Perez has kept our property values strong for 3 years. She organized charity drives. She carried groceries for elderly neighbors. Her words were met with loud applause from nearly half the room of 37 residents who genuinely believed I was the villain, not Grace. Then Mike Peterson, a 45-year-old insurance agent, stood slowly, looking like he wanted to vanish into the floor. "Look," he began hesitantly, "I don't know what to believe anymore." "A broken bar. Look, what if we're wrong?" Mike Peterson said, his voice heavy with fear. "What if Grace is innocent, and we just ruined her reputation? She could sue us into bankruptcy. I've got 2 kids in college. I can't afford to gamble with this." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about justice. For half the room, siding with me meant risking their financial stability. The pressure was suffocating. When Tom called me up to present my evidence, the silence was so sharp you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. Playing that wire recording of Grace's own voice admitting she poisoned Buddy was like detonating a bomb in the middle of a church service. I had to use extreme measures to protect community environmental standards, her recorded voice said. Gasps erupted. People covered their mouths in shock, but even then, her loyalists didn't budge. That recording could be doctored, Helen barked from the crowd. It's convenient evidence from someone desperate for revenge. What did she think I had a Hollywood studio editing team on retainer? That's when Emily Smith did something I'll never forget. The single mother who depended on her treasurer job for health insurance stood up, carrying a banker's box so heavy it looked like it might topple her. She walked straight to the front, nerves etched all over her face, and spoke with a trembling but determined voice. Grace Perez embezzled $38,000 from our community over the last 18 months, Emily declared. I have the bank statements. I have forged authorization forms with my signature. I have proof of fake vendor payments to a company she created herself. The room erupted like someone had poured gasoline on a fire. Parents who had defended Grace moments earlier now shouted, demanding answers about what happened to their children's playground fund. Rita Silva, a grandmother, looked pale. My granddaughter keeps asking when the new swings Grace promised are coming. You're telling me she stole that money to gamble? Emily laid down casino withdrawal receipts that matched the missing funds almost to the dollar. Watching the crowd's faith collapse in real time was like seeing dominoes fall, each one a shattered illusion. When the vote finally came, the decision was as close as it could get. 41 to 37 to strip Grace of every HOA position. 4 votes to just 4 stood between justice and letting a criminal keep running our lives. But victory felt hollow. Nearly half the neighborhood still believed I was the villain, and Emily's financial revelations made our situation 10 times worse. After Grace's theft, the HOA had just $1,200 left in its accounts, barely enough to patch a pothole, let alone cover lawsuits or maintain the community. That's when I made my move. I'll contribute $5,000 a year for community lake access, I announced. It's below market rate for waterfront use, but it'll give us the stability we need. The vote barely passed to 40 to 38. Even after everything, nearly half of my neighbors resisted. And so, in a cruel twist of irony, I found myself paying to use the very lake my family had owned for a century. Grace had tried to steal it from me, and now I was the one subsidizing the community just to keep the peace. But Grace wasn't finished with me. Within 48 hours of her arrest, 12 parents at my school filed official complaints demanding my removal. 12. They painted me as some unstable menace harassing neighbors. My principal, Dr. Williams, called me in with a look that said my career was hanging by a thread. Logan, I've known you 8 years. I don't believe these accusations, but the district is under enormous pressure from powerful families. We have to investigate. That means you're suspended with pay until this is resolved. Suspended for standing up to the woman who killed my dog and robbed my neighbors blind. The injustice was staggering. And worse, I knew some of the parents filing complaints had kids in my own classes. Those kids were probably hearing their parents call their teacher a lunatic over dinner. But the campaign against me didn't stop at my job. Someone likely Grace Elias launched a coordinated effort to make my life miserable. My car was keyed 3 times in 1 week. A baseball bat smashed my mailbox. Pieces scattered across my lawn like a warning. Every night, my house got pelted with eggs. And then came the finally someone spray-painted community destroyer in blood red letters across my garage door, a message that cost me nearly $800 to clean up. Officer Luis Wilson began stopping by my place more often, patrolling in the evenings to keep an eye on things, but the concern in his eyes unsettled me more than the vandalism itself. Grace made bail, he told me one night. Somebody dropped $35,000 in cash to get her out. That's not her money, or she doesn't have access from jail. Logan, whoever's backing her has deep pockets. The thought that Grace had powerful allies working behind the scenes while she sat in a cell chilled me to the bone. What had I stumbled into? All I wanted was to hold a corrupt HOA president accountable, and suddenly I was staring down something far bigger. Then came the break-ins, professional ones, not kids smashing windows or random burglars. These were precise, calculated intrusions. I'd come home from dealing with my suspension at work to find desk drawers open just a crack, books slightly shifted, and computer files accessed while I was gone. Whoever it was, they weren't there to steal electronics. They were searching methodically for something specific. The breaking point arrived at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday. I woke to the faint sound of a door handle rattling, followed by someone moving around the outside of my house, testing every window. My pulse hammered as I gripped the baseball bat I now kept by my bed, whispering into the phone while dialing 911. There's someone outside a broken bar, they're trying to get in. By the time the police arrived 15 minutes later, the intruder had vanished, leaving only muddy footprints that trailed to the lake's edge and stopped, as if the person had walked straight into the water. The next day, Tom showed me security footage that left my hands shaking. My camera caught this at 3:15 a.m., he said. On the screen, a figure in full scuba gear emerged from the lake like some kind of aquatic commando, prowled around my property for 20 minutes, then slipped back underwater without a trace. Logan, Tom said grimly, this isn't random. This is military-level planning. Who has underwater infiltration capabilities? And what could they possibly be looking for in your lake? Grace's trial soon began, and her defense attorney looked every bit the part of a man representing someone with mysterious financial backers, tailored suit, polished smile, and not an ounce of conscience. On day one of jury selection, he worked the room like a magician, spinning Grace's image into something sympathetic. To him, she wasn't a manipulative hoe tyrant, she was a grieving widow drowning in medical debt and gambling addiction. My client is a victim of circumstance, he said smoothly, not some predator. She deserves compassion, not condemnation. The prosecution should have had an airtight case. We had Grace's own voice admitting to killing Buddy, Emily's evidence of $38,000 embezzled, and testimony from more than a dozen neighbors about her fraudulent schemes. But her lawyer played an entirely different game. He leaned on emotions, parading witnesses who painted Grace as a selfless volunteer, a heartbroken wife, and a woman spiraling after losing her husband. Ladies and gentlemen, he said during his opening, you're going to hear about a woman who made mistakes, yes, but mistakes born of grief. What you won't hear is the truth, that she was targeted by a vindictive neighbor determined to ruin her life under the guise of protecting community standards. Grace Perez is not a criminal, she is a victim of Logan Reed's obsession. Watching her in court was surreal. Gone was the venomous woman who had threatened me face to face. In her place sat a fragile widow, dabbing tears and whispering about her husband's final months. I never wanted anyone hurt, she murmured into the microphone. Buddy's death was an accident during environmental treatment. I only wanted to protect our water. When the prosecution played the recording, Grace shifted into righteous indignation. I was speaking metaphorically, she insisted. Mr. Reed twisted my words to make me sound guilty. I've spent years protecting this community, and this is how I'm repaid? Her ability to spin every damning piece of evidence into something misunderstood was horrifyingly effective. But Emily's testimony cut through all of it. Calm, steady, and armed with records, she dismantled Grace's charade. She wasn't protecting this community, Emily told the jury firmly. She was stealing from it. She took $38,000 from the Children's Playground Fund to cover her gambling debts. One by one, she laid out the forged signatures, the false invoices, and the casino withdrawals that matched the missing funds exactly. The courtroom went silent. The jurors deliberated for 3 long, punishing days while I paced the courthouse corridors, every step heavy with uncertainty. I spent those 3 days of jury deliberation questioning every choice that had led me to this point. Luis did his best to keep my spirits up, repeating that jury trials are unpredictably, that sometimes it only takes one person to fall for a sob story. Still, the waiting gnawed at me, especially knowing Grace's mysterious supporters were still lurking in the background, watching, waiting a broken bar, convinced there was something in my lake worth finding. When the foreman finally stood and read guilty on all counts, I felt something I hadn't felt since the night Buddy died, a pure, crushing relief. Grace's fragile widow act collapsed instantly. She erupted into screaming accusations about conspiracies and setups as deputies pulled her away. "You don't know what you've done," she shrieked at me. "This isn't over. Oh, you have no idea what you're really dealing with." Judge Patricia Washington, a seasoned veteran of white-collar crime cases, wasn't moved by Grace's dramatics. "Mrs. Perez," she said firmly, "you systematically deceived your neighbors, stole community funds, and committed deliberate acts of animal cruelty for profit. You are hereby sentenced to 4 years and 8 months in state prison, along with $45,000 restitution to be paid to your victims. You are permanently barred from serving in any community leadership role or HOA position." The courtroom was packed with neighbors who had come to witness justice finally being served. Tom gave a moving impact statement about how Grace's harassment had shattered his family's sense of safety. Emily spoke about the courage it took to come forward despite threats to her livelihood. But when it was my turn, the room fell silent. "Your Honor," I said, locking eyes with Grace, "this woman didn't just steal money. She murdered my best friend to try to silence me, and when that failed, she attempted to take my family's property. She terrorized an entire neighborhood to feed her addiction." Buddy was a loyal, innocent animal who suffered in agony because Grace decided her debts were more important than his life. That isn't desperation, that's evil. Grace was led away in handcuffs. But even as relief settled in, unease lingered. As neighbors gathered to congratulate me, I caught sight of Grace's attorney in hushed conversation with a sharply dressed stranger I didn't recognize. The man snapped photos of me while the lawyer slipped him a thick manila envelope. "The teacher doesn't realize what he stepped into," I overheard the lawyer mutter. The stranger glanced up at me, his eyes cold and calculating. "Don't worry, we'll take it from here." A chill ran through me. What situation was there to handle? Grace was convicted, justice served. Wasn't it over? Luis noticed the tension on my face as we left the courthouse. "What's wrong?" he asked, scanning the crowd with the cautious instincts of a man who had been a cop for 25 years. I told him what I'd overheard. His expression hardened instantly. "Grace might be in prison," he said quietly, "but someone with serious money has been protecting her since day one. That bail didn't pay itself, and attorneys like that don't come cheap. Stay sharp, Logan." That night should have been a celebration. 18 long months of harassment and fear were finally over. Grace Perez was behind bars. My neighborhood was safe. Justice had prevailed. And yet a broken bar. I couldn't sleep. The lawyer's words gnawed at me, and the stranger's icy stare haunted me. He'd looked at me not as a person, but as a problem that needed to be solved. It reminded me too much of Grace's sinister smile the day she handed me that first violation. Grace was gone. But the question loomed, who was the man with her lawyer? And what had I stumbled into that I still didn't understand? Funny thing about hitting rock bottom, it strips away illusions. You see yourself, and what you're really capable of, with brutal clarity. 3 months after Grace's sentencing, I was technically unemployed. The school district had politely suggested that I might be happier elsewhere after all the controversy. My savings were gutted by legal fees, and half the neighborhood still whispered that I was the villain. But I had also done something undeniable. I'd exposed corruption and helped put a criminal behind bars, and that taught me a lesson most people never learn. A very few know how to actually fight back against entrenched, institutional corruption. The first time I spoke publicly about it wasn't even planned. Dr. Judy Mitchell, organizer of the Regional Home Management Conference, reached out after following Grace's case in the local press. "Logan," she said, "we're hosting 300 property managers and board members this year. They need to understand how corruption happens and how to stop it. Would you be willing to share your story? The thought of standing in front of 300 strangers was terrifying, but part of me knew I had to say yes. The thought of standing in front of strangers and reliving the most painful 18 months of my life terrified me, but the speaking fee $2,500 a day was more than I'd earned in my final month of teaching. That first speech turned out to be a turning point. Standing on the stage at the Marriott Conference Center, looking at hundreds of people who lived and breathed HOA politics, I realized I had unintentionally become an expert in something people were desperate to understand. When I finished sharing Grace's story of the fabricated violations, the embezzlement, the cruelty, the manipulation, of the applause lasted nearly 5 minutes. But the real impact came afterward. In the conversations, one woman told me, "Our HOA president has been handing out bogus fines for years. The way you documented everything could save us." Another man, from Arizona, said his treasurer had been acting suspicious with financial records, while homeowners were suddenly being hit with expensive, targeted violations. "How did you prove it was systematic fraud?" he asked. By the time the conference ended, 12 people had requested private consultations, and 6 communities had invited me to speak. That's how the HOA Defense Academy was born, an online course teaching people how to track violations, research property rights, and organize against corrupt leadership. I thought maybe 100 people might be interested. Instead, within the first month, 847 signed up at $297 each. The numbers hit me like a thunderbolt. More than $250,000 in revenue from knowledge I'd earned through surviving Grace's campaign against me. The true breakthrough came when students started sending their own success stories. Maria Santos, a grandmother in Texas, used my methods to expose her HOA president for stealing $60,000 over 3 years. "Your process saved our retirement community," she wrote. "The evidence we gathered gave the police exactly what they needed to make arrests and recover most of the money." It was then I realized this wasn't just about my fight with Grace anymore. It was about something bigger. The lake, too, became an unexpected source of opportunity. The access fees I'd once negotiated for my own neighborhood caught the attention of nearby communities. Soon, 4 different HOAs were bidding against each other for access rights. What started as a $5,000 yearly fee quickly grew into $10,000 as demand rose. Then came corporate bookings. Apparently, companies were eager for authentic lakefront retreats for team-building events. My first booking, a small tech startup, paid $3,500 for a weekend. Within 6 months, I was charging $8,500 per retreat, with weekends booked out for the year. The irony was impossible to ignore. Grace's attempt to steal my lake had actually made it more valuable than I ever imagined. The book deal happened next. A persistent literary agent who had seen my viral news interviews convinced me to put my story and methods into print. The publisher loved the idea and offered me a $45,000 advance for fighting HOA corruption, a teacher's guide to community justice. It felt surreal. I'd gone from writing lesson plans about the Revolutionary War to creating a guidebook that communities across the country could use to protect themselves. But more surprising than the money was how much I loved this new role. Teaching history had been rewarding, but teaching people how to confront real-world corruption, to expose fraud, and to save their neighborhoods, that felt like a calling. Every time a student overturned a fraudulent fine, exposed a corrupt official, or saved their community from theft, it felt like another victory over the Graceperzes of the world. The financial transformation was staggering. Within 9 months of Grace's conviction, I was earning more in a single month than I had ever made in an entire year of teaching. Speaking fees brought in $15,000 to $20,000 monthly. Online courses added another $12,000. Lake access revenue provided a steady 5-figure stream with almost no effort. The exhausted, broke teacher who once swam laps to escape his problems was gone. I had somehow crossed the line from being a broke, overworked teacher into a successful entrepreneur with more income than I knew how to handle. But with success came problems I hadn't expected. The private investigators shadowing me became harder to ignore and far more professional. At speaking engagements, I began spotting the same unfamiliar faces over and over. They posed as attendees, but their questions were unusually precise. Details about my property, my home security, even my daily routines. Louise confirmed my fears after running background checks on 3 of them. All were licensed investigators out of Nevada, employed by firms that specialized in asset recovery and high-profile client protection. "Logan," he warned me during one of our monthly meetings, "this isn't random. Someone with serious resources is watching you. Asset recovery means they think you have something that's theirs, and protection services mean they're willing to spend real money to get it back. These guys don't come cheap and they run $500 to $1,000 a day." As my reputation grew, the surveillance escalated. Photographers with long lenses tracked my every move, documenting business meetings, casual outings, even what day I took my garbage to the curb. They weren't just watching me, they were compiling a complete profile of my life. Whoever was paying them clearly considered me either a major threat or a very valuable target. But a threat to what? Grace was behind bars, stripped of her power and influence. What could anyone possibly still want from me? The breaking point came after a 3-day speaking tour in Chicago. When I returned home, it was clear someone had been living in my house, not just snooping. The guest room bed had been used. My shower showed signs of recent use. Meals had been cooked in my kitchen. Every file in my home office had been handled. The intruder had tried to cover their tracks, but not well enough. Louise brought in a forensics team, who discovered fingerprints not in any database, DNA evidence proving someone had stayed at least 48 hours, and subtle traces of advanced electronic surveillance equipment that had been installed and removed. "This is no ordinary investigator," Louise said gravely. "Whoever this is has training and funding that puts them in a different league. We might be talking federal-level operations here. You may even need to think about witness protection." 18 months after Grace's conviction, my life had become unrecognizable. The anxious, cornered teacher who once swam laps to escape his problems was now pulling in more than $400,000 a year through speaking engagements, online courses, and lake access deals. I'd been featured on national news, consulted with state attorneys general on HOA reform, and helped uncover corruption in 47 communities. What people began calling the Logan method of documenting and dismantling abuse of power had grown into an international business model. My speaking career expanded far beyond HOA circles. I was now a featured guest at corporate conferences and law schools. My keynote fee had risen to $15,000, and my calendar was fully booked through the next year, with stops in Canada, the UK, and Australia. Even Fortune 500 companies were hiring me to teach executives about leadership ethics and community accountability. A surreal thought, considering my expertise came from being targeted by a dog-killing, gambling-obsessed HOA president. But success rewrites history, and suddenly I was seen not as a victim, but as a global authority on community justice. The education platform exceeded everything I ever dreamed. Over 15,000 people had completed my courses, with a stunning 94% success rate in their own fights against corruption. The certification program I launched began training paralegals and advocates in property rights law, creating a network of defenders across the country. That side of the business alone was pulling in $20,000 a month, fueled by wave after wave of success stories. Even my property investments were paying off. Grace's foreclosed home, which I'd purchased at auction for $156,000, became a luxury vacation rental. Marketed as the former HOA Karen's house, it earned more than $10,000 a month from guests intrigued by its infamous past. The lake rights, too, had grown more valuable. Communities were now paying $15,000 per year for access, and the demand had become so high that I kept a waiting list to choosing which HOAs would be granted the privilege. But while the financial success was staggering, the harassment had reached terrifying new levels. Surveillance teams now tracked me with military precision. They knew my schedule better than I did, had photographed everyone I'd spoken to in the last 6 months, and seemed laser-focused on my financial arrangements and partnerships. Louise confirmed it. The firms involved were specialists in high-value asset recovery, which meant only one thing: someone out there believed I had something worth taking back. The real breakthrough came from the last place I ever expected: Grace herself. In early September, Nearly 2 years into her prison sentence, she called me. At first, I nearly declined, but curiosity made me accept. The voice I heard was nothing like the confident, venomous woman who once terrorized my neighborhood. Prison had shattered her. She sounded weak, broken, even remorseful, an entirely different person than the one who had strutted into court years earlier. "Logan," she began without pleasantries, "I need to tell you the truth about why I really targeted your property. It wasn't random, and it wasn't just about money. There's something buried under your lake that people are willing to kill for. They threatened my family to force me into getting you to sell." Her words hit like a bucket of ice water. "What are you talking about, Grace?" I demanded, but she pressed forward before I could interrupt. 3 years ago, men in expensive suits cornered me at the casino. They knew everything in my gambling debts, my foreclosure, all of it. They promised to pay off what I owed and hand me $50,000 in cash if I could force you to sell your property within 6 months. When you refused, they told me to escalate until you had no choice. And Logan, a broken bar, her voice trembled, "I poisoned Buddy because they threatened to kill my daughter if I failed." I was stunned. Grace hadn't been acting alone. She was just a pawn in someone else's plan, a plan that had begun long before I ever inherited the land. "What's buried under my lake?" I asked. Her reply was even more chilling. "I don't know exactly. They called it historically significant mineral deposits. Whatever it is, they said it was worth enough to justify any level of pressure. They already have geological surveys, mineral rights documents, everything they need to extract it once they own the land." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Logan, a broken bar, they're still after it. My failure didn't end things. It just forced them to change their approach. Those people following you, they aren't trying to kill you. They're trying to find another way to make you sell. But if that doesn't work, a broken bar." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Anyone who would threaten her children's lives over mineral rights wasn't going to back down because their first plan failed. Suddenly, everything about her case made sense. The high-priced attorneys, the mysterious financial backers, the relentless surveillance. Grace had been a desperate woman being controlled by powerful people, and now that she had failed, they were moving on to Plan B. But what was Plan B? And how much danger was I really in? Luis treated Grace's confession with the gravity it deserved. He brought in federal authorities immediately. "If mineral deposits on your property are valuable enough for someone to commit multiple felonies to get them," he explained after briefing the FBI, "this isn't just local corruption anymore. We're looking at organized crime, interstate conspiracy as serious players." The FBI wasted no time. Their investigation revealed geological surveys on surrounding properties dating back 5 years, all commissioned by shell companies tied to a Nevada-based mining consortium. The mineral rights on my land alone were estimated at between $8 and $12 million. That explained the years of pressure, the hundreds of thousands spent on legal manipulation and private investigators, and the life-threatening intimidation tactics. But knowing the truth didn't bring me peace. If anything, it made everything worse. These weren't desperate individuals like Grace, clawing for survival. These were powerful, highly funded operators who had already proven their willingness to threaten murder to achieve their goals. Grace might have been locked up for 20 months, but the people behind her were still free. They were still after my land, and they were still tightening the net around me. Even as my neighbors celebrated my success, hailing me as a hero for exposing corruption and bringing justice, I couldn't shake the dread. Behind the applause, I knew the fight was far from over. Property values in our neighborhood had soared by more than a third since Grace's conviction, and a waiting list of 19 families was eager to join our model community. But no amount of prosperity could quiet the unease I felt, knowing dangerous conspirators were still circling my land like predators. My fears were confirmed by a mysterious phone call shortly after I'd run into Grace at the grocery store. The voice on the other end was male, calm, and unfamiliar, yet he somehow knew details about Buddy's death that had never been made public. "Mr. Logan, we need to talk about Grace Perez," he said. "There are things about her case you don't know, things that affect your safety." When I pressed him for his identity, his answer made my blood run cold. "I'm someone who tried to warn Grace 3 years ago. Meet me tomorrow, a broken bar, or you'll end up like your dog." who had tried to warn Grace before everything spiraled out of control. And how did this stranger know about the mineral rights conspiracy? In contrast to those lingering shadows, my wedding to Judy became a powerful symbol of resilience. We exchanged vows by the lakefront at the very spot where Grace had once issued her first fraudulent violation, surrounded by 189 guests who had witnessed our community's transformation from battleground to model of unity. We celebrated not only our marriage but our collective triumph over corruption. Judge Patricia Washington, the same judge who had sentenced Grace to prison, officiated the ceremony. Her warm smile seemed to say that justice and joy could coexist when good people refused to let evil win. What followed was a 3-day community festival that felt like the ultimate victory lap. Neighbors who had once been divided by Grace's manipulations now stood together, bound by principles of fairness, transparency, and respect. And in the sweetest twist of irony, the entire celebration was funded with $67,000 taken from Grace's restitution payments. Children laughed on playground equipment that had been delayed by her theft, while their parents enjoyed food, music, and fellowship paid for with money once stolen from them. The financial turnaround in my own life still astonished me at times. Just a few years earlier, I had been a teacher scraping by on $54,000 a year. Now, I was generating over $600,000 annually through speaking engagements, online courses, book royalties, and property investments. Even the lake itself had become profitable, bringing in $50,000 a year from access fees charged to 5 neighboring communities, plus another $120,000 from corporate retreat bookings. Ironically, Grace's attempt to steal my family's property had turned it into the most valuable piece of land in the county. But beyond my personal success, the true satisfaction came from the broader impact of Grace's case. My HOA Defense Academy had trained over 40,000 people in 15 different countries, boasting a 96% success rate in helping communities root out corruption. 47 corrupt HOA officials had resigned rather than endure investigations similar to the one that exposed Grace, and 8 states had already enacted Logan's laws, requiring greater transparency and oversight in neighborhood associations. Grace's crimes had backfired so spectacularly that they had sparked a nationwide reform movement. As for the mystery caller, he revealed himself at last. He was FBI Special Agent Marcus Webb, who had been tracking the mineral rights conspiracy for 3 years. His cryptic warning about ending up like Buddy had really been an offer of protection, a way to push me toward cooperating with their broader investigation. "We've been following this Nevada-based mining consortium for 5 years," Agent Webb explained when we met. "They specialize in using corrupt local officials to drive property owners off their land through harassment, fraud, and intimidation." The truth about my lake was even more shocking than I had imagined. Geological surveys revealed deposits of rare earth minerals worth around $15 million, but extracting them would completely destroy the ecosystem and wipe out most of my property. The mining consortium had been systematically buying up lakefront land in the region, coercing owners into selling at below-market prices through corrupt tactics. Grace had simply been one of their most effective operatives until she came up against someone who refused to break. Agent Webb's files showed that similar schemes had played out in at least a dozen states. Grace's downfall had provided the missing link in their case, exposing just how deep the corruption ran. The case against the mining consortium finally produced the breakthrough evidence federal prosecutors had been waiting for. My documentation methods and community organizing techniques, they told me, were now being studied by law enforcement agencies across the country. "You accidentally became an expert in fighting the very kind of institutional corruption we've been struggling to prosecute for decades," one agent said with admiration. The federal trials that followed drew national media attention. My story became a symbol of how determined citizens could dismantle criminal enterprises by relying on persistence, organization, and evidence. The consortium's executives were sentenced to between 15 and 25 years in federal prison, and dozens of corrupted local officials in multiple states faced charges of their own. Grace, who had cooperated with federal investigators, managed to have her sentence reduced to 32 months, but in the end, she still lost everything. Her release was almost anticlimactic in its quietness and deeply satisfying to witness. The woman who once terrorized an entire neighborhood shuffled out of prison carrying her belongings in a single garbage bag, looking decades older than her 56 years. No family came to pick her up. With her felony conviction, ruined reputation, and ties to a federal conspiracy, she was unemployable in any role requiring trust or responsibility. The confrontation I'd half expected never came. Grace was too broken to pose a threat anymore. When I unexpectedly saw her working as a cashier at a discount grocery store miles away from our community, she barely acknowledged me. The sharp, predatory intelligence that once made her dangerous had been replaced by hollow resignation. She whispered a quiet apology for Buddy and for the harm she'd caused, though it sounded more like routine than genuine regret. Then came the letter. It arrived during our wedding reception, a registered envelope sent by one of Grace's former cellmates. The instructions were chilling. Deliver only if Grace didn't survive her sentence. But her early release had triggered it anyway. Inside was a handwritten confession that revealed more than she'd ever admitted in court. Logan needs to know why I really targeted his property, it began. It wasn't random. It wasn't just money. There's something buried under his lake that people are willing to kill for. They threatened my family if I didn't make him sell. Logan, you're still in danger. The mineral rights people don't give up. They have surveys, permits, and enough money to keep coming. Buddy's death was supposed to be a warning about what happens if you resist. I should have warned you, but instead I became their weapon. Reading those words in the middle of a celebration felt surreal. The woman who had destroyed my peace of mind and nearly ruined my life had also, in her own twisted way, been trying to protect me, making her attacks so obvious that I was forced to fight back and uncover the conspiracy. Her methods had been reckless, cruel, and unforgivable, but without them, the truth might have remained buried. In a strange way, her failed intimidation had saved us both from something far worse than HOA disputes and embezzlement charges. Even with that knowledge, forgiveness never came. Grace had chosen fear and selfishness over courage. Buddy had died in agony because she refused to risk herself for the sake of an innocent life. The mining consortium may have pulled the strings, but it was Grace who carried out the act that cut the deepest. Justice had been served. Consequences had been faced. But some wounds never fully heal. The symmetry of it all was undeniable. A fraudulent fine of $1,000 had become a $600,000 annual income. An attempt to strip me of my land had made it worth millions. Efforts to ruin my reputation had instead transformed me into a nationally recognized advocate for communities everywhere. The once struggling teacher who swam laps to forget his problems now stood before crowds, earning $25,000 per speech, teaching thousands how to fight corruption and win. Meanwhile, Grace Perez earned $13 an hour stocking groceries. That was justicia, not revenge, not cruelty. Justice was transforming suffering into strength, and using the ashes of what evil tried to destroy to build something enduring and beautiful. As for what lies beneath the lakia and who threatened Grace's family to force her into targeting me, that remains a story for another day. If this wild journey stirred something in you, let me know you're on the side of justice. This is Anna Dramanest, and I'll see you in the next incredible story of ordinary people achieving extraordinary victories. Until then, keep fighting the good fight.